Think about this for a second. In 1939, America created its first food stamp program. Before that, there was no SNAP card and no national guarantee that a family without money could buy groceries. So what happened when a father lost his job? The rent was overdue, and there was no food left in the cupboard. If you enjoy these deep dives into the systems people assume have always existed, please subscribe. So, before food stamps, being poor in America was not just about having less money. It could mean being one accident, one bad harvest, one factory closure, or one illness away from hunger. For most of American history, there was no federal welfare state in the modern sense. The federal government did not routinely step in to make sure people had food. Relief was considered a local responsibility. If it was considered anybody's responsibility at all, that meant poor families had to rely on whoever was nearby. In cities, that could mean relatives sharing a crowded apartment, neighbours lending flour, or a local church handing out baskets of food. In rural areas, families often survived through gardens, chickens, preserved vegetables, hunting, fishing, and informal exchanges with neighbours. If you had land, even a tiny amount, you had a chance to produce something. If you had none, life was much more precarious. And if you were unemployed in an industrial city with no garden, no savings, and nobody able to help, you were in serious trouble. There were charities, there were religious groups, there were private relief societies. But charity was inconsistent, often humiliating, and almost never enough for everyone. Assistance could depend on where you lived, what religion you were, whether officials thought you were deserving, and whether they believed you were genuinely unable to work. That distinction mattered enormously. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, poverty was often treated as a moral failure rather than an economic problem. If someone was poor, many people assumed they must have been lazy, reckless, drunk, irresponsible, or simply unwilling to work. So help often came with rules, questions, inspections, and shame. A widow with children might receive support. An injured worker might receive support. But a healthy man without work could be treated with suspicion, even when there were no jobs available anywhere. Then came the Great Depression. After the stock market crash of 1929, businesses failed, banks collapsed, farms were foreclosed on, and unemployment surged. By 1933, roughly 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. This was not a small group of people making bad choices. It was a national economic collapse. A factory worker could lose his job on Friday and be standing in a breadline by Monday. Families sold furniture, pawned wedding rings, took in boarders, skipped meals, and moved in with relatives. People who had spent their whole lives working suddenly had to ask strangers for food. Soup kitchens became one of the most recognisable images of the Depression. Charities, churches, and local governments gave out bowls of soup, bread, coffee, and whatever else they could afford. Bread lines stretched through city streets. Men stood for hours in the cold for one hot meal. But soup kitchens were not a complete answer. A bowl of soup might keep you alive for a day. It did not restore a household budget. It did not let a parent choose what to feed their children. It did not pay for milk, shoes, rent, heating, or medicine. The deeper problem was that local governments were running out of money at exactly the moment they were needed most. Normally, towns and cities helped fund relief through local taxes. But during the Depression, tax revenue fell because businesses were failing, property values were collapsing, and people could not pay. The places with the most desperate families often had the least ability to help them, and this created one of the strangest contradictions in American history. People were starving, but food was being destroyed. Farmers were producing more food than the market could profitably absorb. When too much wheat, cotton, pork, milk, or fruit came onto the market, prices crashed. Farmers could not make enough money to cover their debts, workers, seed, machinery, and land payments. So food that could have fed hungry people was sometimes dumped, burned, or destroyed to reduce supply and push prices back up. Milk was poured away, crops were left to rot, animals were slaughtered. Meanwhile, unemployed families lined up for soup. It sounds insane because it was insane, morally, emotionally, and economically. But it revealed the central problem. America did not have a system for connecting food surpluses with people who needed food. The New Deal tried to change that. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration created emergency relief programs, public works jobs, and new forms of federal assistance. The government began buying surplus farm products and distributing some of them through relief agencies. That was a major shift. Instead of treating hunger as purely a private charity problem, the federal government began treating it as a national economic problem. But direct food distribution had limits. Imagine receiving a box of whatever the government happened to have too much of. Maybe flour, maybe butter, maybe dried beans, maybe canned meat. It helped, but families did not get much choice. And distributing huge amounts of food across a country as large as the United States was complicated, expensive, and often inefficient. Officials wanted a system that could solve several problems at once. They wanted hungry families to receive more food. They wanted farmers to sell surplus crops. They wanted grocery stores to benefit from additional customers. And they wanted the government to stimulate spending without simply handing out unrestricted cash. That is how food stamps entered the picture. The first experimental food stamp plan began in Rochester, New York, on May 16, 1939. It was not yet the permanent nationwide program people associate with food stamps today. It was an experiment, built for a Depression-era economy, drowning in surplus food and unemployment. The original system was surprisingly unusual. Families receiving relief had to buy orange stamps equal to what they normally spent on food. For every $1 of orange stamps they bought, they received an extra 50 cents in blue stamps for free. The orange stamps could be spent on any food. The blue stamps could only be used on items the government had officially declared to be surplus. So if a family had $1, they could turn it into $1.50 worth of groceries. But the extra 50 cents came with a condition. It had to be spent on foods America had too much of. Those foods included things like butter, eggs, flour, cornmeal, oranges, grapefruit, prunes, dried beans, and other agricultural products. This was not just an anti-hunger program. It was an economic machine. The government used food stamps to direct buying power towards surplus crops. Poor families got more food. Farmers got buyers. Grocery stores made sales. And the government reduced the political embarrassment of destroying food while people went hungry. The first person to use food stamp benefits was Mabel McFiggin, a housewife in Rochester, New York. On May 16, 1939, she used her stamps at a local grocery store. That small purchase marked the beginning of a program that would eventually become part of everyday American life. But even this first version had limits. You had to be on relief. You had to have some money to buy the orange stamps in the first place, and you could only use blue stamps for the food selected by the government. If your family needed something that was not considered surplus, the blue stamps could not help. That means the earliest food stamp program was not a simple promise that nobody would go hungry. It was a compromise between public need, farm economics, government budgets, and the political fear of giving people too much help. Still, it grew quickly. By August 1942, the program had expanded to 1,741 counties and 88 cities. By May 1943, around 4 million people were participating. Then, oddly enough, it ended. The first food stamp plan was shut down in 1943, not because hunger had been permanently solved, but because World War II transformed the economy. Wartime factories needed workers. Unemployment plummeted. Agricultural surpluses were no longer the same problem. Food was suddenly more constrained, and the conditions that created the program had changed. Food stamps would return in pilot form under President John F. Kennedy in 1961, then become a permanent national program through the Food Stamp Act of 1964. The modern system eventually evolved into SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. But the question in this video is not just how food stamps began, it is what came before them. Before 1939, poor Americans survived through a mixture of work, family, community, charity, and sheer desperation. Some families had farms or gardens, some had relatives, some had churches willing to help, some got local relief, some went to soup kitchens, and many people simply ate less. Parents skipped meals so children could eat. Families watered down soup, stretched flour, ate cheap starches, relied on bread and beans, or survived on whatever was available. Hunger was often invisible, because people did not always starve dramatically. They just became weaker, thinner, sicker, and more exhausted over time. That is what makes the story of food stamps important. America did not suddenly discover hunger in 1939. It discovered that hunger could exist alongside abundance, and that the market alone was not going to fix it. The first food stamp program was an attempt to connect two things that should never have been separate. Food people could not afford to buy, and food farmers could not afford to sell. Today, SNAP is often argued over as a modern political issue, but its origins are deeply practical. It began with a country asking a very basic question. If we have food and people are hungry, why are they not eating? And the answer was never because the food didn't exist. It was because access to food depended on money. That was true before food stamps. It was true during the Great Depression. And in many ways, it is still true now. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more deep dives into the systems that shape everyday life. The things people assume have always existed, until you look closer and realize they are often only one crisis, one law, or one political decision old.